If you're interviewing for a software engineering position, which requires you to work with Spring Boot, a typical interview question might be to explain the different ways of injecting Spring beans and their pros and cons. We're gonna look at 3 different ways which usually the interviewers are looking for, plus an extra, which is a neat thing to be aware of. Alright, so let's look to the code. Spoiler alert, you can already see what the fourth one is gonna be, so I'm just gonna hide it. But anyways, we're gonna have a very basic Spring application. Really, it doesn't really do anything. We're just gonna demonstrate the different ways of actually doing dependency injection. So the first one is constructor-based service. Oh yeah, we already have one Spring service defined, which is very easy. It just logs something to the console. So that's gonna be the demonstration when we import something. So the first one is constructor-based. So what is this? So I can actually define something like this, which is not that interesting so far, but you can already generate a constructor if Spring lets me, exactly. And then I can use the auto-wired annotation to tell Spring to actually inject the bean. Now, it's all good and fine. Let's actually see if this works. So I'm just going to implement the command line runner. If you're not familiar with the command line runner, essentially once Spring context is initialized, it's going to make sure that any bean who implements this interface runs this code. If you need order, if order is important to you, you can also define the order. But anyways, let's just call the service.hiYouTube and run this code. And as you can see, we see hello there YouTube. So all do good, nice, this works. Fun fact, or not fun fact, but if you only have one constructor, Spring can actually figure out that any parameter, which is actually a bean time, it can inject it. Thus, you don't need the auto-wired annotation and everything will work just the same. Also, we can go one step further. If you're using Lombok, which is actually quite common nowadays, you can use this required args constructor parameter, which essentially generates code. In our case, it's going to generate a constructor based on the required arguments. And what are the required arguments? Well, it's the final properties, because obviously we need to initialize those during creation. So what you can do is just remove this, and now with this annotation we have the same code as before. And if I run this, well, surprise surprise, things still do work. So that's all good and nice. Let's actually go to the next one, which is the field-based one. So let's add the service. I think this is the one which most people are familiar with. So I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to use the auto-wired and bam, implement the same command line runner and just run something. And then again, so this is, we have basically the same result as before, but now instead of doing finals and constructors, we are essentially just marking this parameter as auto-wired. Now the benefit of this is that it's very well, it's not verbose at all. Essentially, you just needed to add like an annotation. The drawback or the con of this solution is that it's difficult to test. Because with the constructor-based one, it's really easy to write any test. So I don't know if I actually wrote the test or not. But yeah, so as you can see, like if you want to do test, it's really very easy to instantiate an instance of this class. Whereas if you go with the field-based service, now you do need to do some reflection. Actually, Spring also needs to do some reflection to get this being available for your service. So the third one is actually called the setter-based injection. So actually, before we do that, let's unmark the service so it doesn't run. So let's mark this as a service. Again, now we're going to implement the command line runner. You probably know this by now. And then what we're going to do is private, okay, as usual, indicate the argument. We're gonna call this, but then, okay, so how is this initialized? Now we are not using auto-wired, but what we are using is actually, we're gonna generate a setter and mark it as auto-wired. And if you do this way, it's essentially very similar to the constructor-based. Spring is gonna figure out if you have a setter auto-wired, is that it needs to inject this type of bean to your method parameter list, and then everything works as expected. If I run this, bam, you see the message. So what's the benefit of this one? I'm not actually sure. I think the most common ones I have seen were the constructor based and then the field based one. I didn't really see the setter one before, but if you have and you have a good use case for that, I mean, leave a comment. All right, let's go to the surprise or the extra, which is the lookup. So how does this work? Well, it's interesting. Essentially, what you can do is same old command line runner, and then here is the interesting part. Okay, I almost wrote it. So we're not gonna do any kind of property like this. No, what we're gonna do is much more interesting. We're gonna do something like public my Spring Base service get service and I don't even and I think I can even throw like an exception here, and this should work. Oh, sorry. And then, so what's the catch? Well, you can mark this with a lookup annotation, and what it should do, and I hope this will work because I actually haven't tested this before with the exception, but I think it should work, is that I can actually call this, and if you're marking a method with the lookup, Spring will try to resolve this return type and actually inject an instance of this bean. This might be relevant when you're working with different scoped components, such as prototype versus the default one, singleton. But let's see that actually this works. And yes, this actually works. So it doesn't matter what you write here because it's never gonna run. What Spring really cares about is this one. When would you use this? I have no idea. This is really just an extra. So that's it. That was the 3+1. So again, constructor based, field based, setter based, and this lookup something. Hope you enjoyed. Maybe you learned something new. If you did, maybe give a like, subscribe, and leave a comment for the algorithm. Thanks, and see you around.